Well, hi everyone and welcome. This is the Reimagine Teachers Academy session on co-creation and performance making in schools. And before we tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today, I just thought it'd be good to introduce ourselves. So my name's Will Maynard, he, him. I am a theatre director primarily. I also do a bit of writing, and for 7 years I was a teacher and head of drama at a school in the Southeast. Kevin.
Okay, I'm Kevin Jenkins. I'm a theatre set and costume designer. I was formerly a teacher as well, though. I taught for 5 years in various schools in Derbyshire. So I taught at Queggs in Ashbourne and Pingle in Swaddling Coat. And then about 15 years ago, I left teaching and went and studied on the Motley Theatre Design course in London, which was a brilliant course, which was run by theatre professionals out of the back of the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane. And the most amazing people used to come in and teach us. And it was a really intense year, which unfortunately that course doesn't run anymore. But for me, that was the step between being a teacher and being a professional theatre designer.
Reimagine is about discovering the artist in every child, but it's easy to forget that that's sort of what you're doing every day as teachers as well. You are artists, that you not only inspire the next generation of artists by being the first contact point for their creative journey, but you are in fact artists yourselves, literally as performers in front of a class, inhabiting a persona and delivering amazing creative experience. But also the work that you produce, whether it's art or whether it's sound or design or theatre or performing arts or music, that's the first reference point for so many young people in their artistic experience, and that stays with them through the rest of their lives. And finding that artist in every child who might go into creative industries or might just have it as a part of who they become, I think is unbelievably important. And so that's what we're sort of, I'm honored to be kind of in the same space as all these people today, really. Just thought it would be helpful to put in just to draw a little bit of context around all of this and the Reimagine program, but also education at the moment. What we really want to focus on today is original approaches to non-traditional performance spaces and how performances can find their way out of the theatre or school hall into other parts of the school or civic spaces. And the reason we want to look at that particularly today is that we've both found that when you do this, something really extraordinary can happen. The simple gesture of not being in a theatre space, of experiencing an environment that children thought is completely they see now in a completely different light, of being on their feet or maneuvering themselves for a view. This also goes for the audience when they're watching something, or walking from one location to another within a school, from one room or space that isn't a theatre to another, and seeing performances in those areas. That forces an audience to really sit up and engage actively with what they're seeing and not be too complacent. At the same time, in these non-traditional spaces, young people can go from feeling like intimidated guests in an audience's space, which is what it often feels like when they are performing in a theatre. They go from feeling like that to feeling like sort of guardians and chaperones and storytellers to an alert, anticipating audience in this sort of carefully curated environment. And we found that the benefits to sort of student curiosity, to kind of peer-to-peer learning and teamwork, very often from previously quite shy young people and those with less of a natural affinity to the performing arts, the way that they can take ownership of spaces that aren't theatre spaces and aren't traditional performance spaces can rise greatly when you move out of that. And I think, the reason that we're particularly interested in this is because when you take drama and you take performance out of a traditional theatre space or out of the school hall or the school theatre, you can make the rest of the school community really sit up and pay attention in a different way. It also provides extraordinary opportunity for cross-curricular collaboration and learning. And that we feel can build a sort of confidence within schools where they feel that performing arts is not this standalone thing, but where actually it is the centerpiece of a broad and balanced curriculum. We know that collaboration between different art forms, between art and music, between music and the performing arts, between DT and between sound and everything, can increase greatly people's sociability, ability to collaborate, flexible thinking. And I think in an environment where performing arts is under a kind of threat, particularly in the catch-up post-COVID, where it's being relegated below academic subjects in so many schools, we've got to find new and innovative ways of really raising its profile and making sure it's the centerpiece of a project-based, broad and balanced curriculum to fight for its legitimacy. And I think, Kevin, did you have a little bit on some experience of where collaborative and cross-curricular stuff has worked well anecdotally?
Yeah, again, it's from personal experience, and because I've got, of course, coming from my point of view, I taught design and technology and art and design. I don't come from a performance background, and in some ways, I'd encourage performing arts teachers to explore other members of staff out there that. I know, and this is difficult to say because I know there's huge pressure on teachers, and I know there's huge time demands on teachers. But at the same time, there's other teachers out there that are interested in theatre and that want to be involved. And I guess Emma, you're a good example here as well. You know, as a head of art, you're wanting to be involved in the production side of a theatrical piece, much the same as I was. So I was kind of on the receiving end of those conversations from a performing arts teacher. And really embraced that as an opportunity to get involved, which I love personally because of my own interests. But in actual fact, there became opportunities for example, design and technology A-level projects to be based around a school production. So I had a couple of students that were able to use their final project to design and create an element of the set for the production. That benefited both the production and those students themselves because the students had a real client. You know, they had the performing arts teacher to go to as the director. They had somebody who could give them the relevant feedback, who they could actually have a proper working relationship with in terms of getting evaluation and that kind of thing. The kind of thing which, to be honest with you, lots of design and technology projects, they kind of have to make that situation up. So it made it actually quite a very real scenario, which benefited those students in D&T as well as benefiting the production. I also taught on a BTEC, which had a unit on making small models, which was able to tie into obviously like model making for theatre purposes and new set design as the basis for that. I think maybe with a little bit more work and a little bit more collaboration, that could have developed into something that could have been more mutually beneficial rather than the hypothetical scenario that I came up with. And something I particularly want to look at later on in the session, in the second half of the session, is how we really encourage the visual arts into. Sorry, my screen jumped then into me being the full view, and it threw me. But how we encourage the visual elements of storytelling and make them very prominent in our devising processes, not just to do with words and script.
Great. And so we've got kind of 4 loose sort of objectives or things that we'd like to consider for the remainder of the session today. And one is we'd love it to be a really good sort of networking and also discussion based, but a sort of opportunity to share best practice on repurposing non-traditional spaces for performance, both in schools and in civic spaces, and how we can bring that performance out into the rest of the school environment. We also want to talk about how we can make standard resources and the things that you just have available to you go further in a creative way. Stationery, chairs, things that you just have around, and Kevin's going to be talking about that. And as I said, we want to talk about how we can build cross-curricular links within schools, how we can make performance sit at the center of all of those other art forms and subjects. And finally, and this is a big question I think Kevin and I have, and we'd love to hear from you on, which is about how do we really empower young people as decision makers in that co-creative environment for these sorts of projects. All right. So to start off, I want you to imagine a scenario, which is you have been asked to create a performing arts-based project for your school commemorating the First World War and exploring its resonance for the world today. By the way, if anyone can't see my screen at any point, just shout, unmute yourself and shout. How do you go about it? Well, that is exactly what I was asked to do when I was in one of my final years of teaching at my school. Fortunately, I had been on a visit a year before to a school called School 21. Now, I don't know if anyone's heard of School 21, but it is a free school based in Newham. And I went to see it, Newham in Stratford, East London. And I went to see it in its first year. And it had a number of distinctive features, but at its core was a philosophy of project-based learning. Now, I didn't know much about this before, and some people may have heard of it, but if a very, very crude, broad summary would be that with project-based learning, you present students with a driving question or challenge to start off a unit of work or exploration. From that, the students, in a guided way, are able to identify what they need to know in order to move forward with that piece of work. So they sort of research, they can identify the things that they need to research. They then go through a process of innovating and creating. So this would be where performance would come in, or artwork, or DT. And then finally, they have a publicly presented product. And depending on the art form you were looking at, if it was a fine art, it might be an exhibition. If it was something drama-based, it might be a performance, or it might be a mixture of all of these. And just as kind of a very, very, again, crude distinction, if we think of traditional learning as being at the start of a unit, you're told what you need to know. You then go a process of essentially memorizing or understanding it. And then you have a problem assigned to you to illustrate how you use that knowledge to kind of test it in the form of an exam or whatever. Problem or project-based learning sort of works a little bit in reverse. You have the big problem assigned, you identify what you need to know, and then you learn and apply by doing the creativity and by solving the problem. And that's how you sort of learn, and that's how it works. And of course, it might not have escaped your notice that the second version is a little bit like putting on a play, or indeed an exhibition, or any kind of art form. You have your project that you are working towards. You know that in order to produce this exhibition or this performance, you need to learn certain things, certain crafts, craft of acting, the craft of a particular art form, the particular lines that you have to learn, or whatever it is. And then, of course, through creating, you find you have learnt and become an expert sort of in that particular craft, and you are applying it to the problem. You're all the time working towards that project. So I think what I just want to emphasize at the moment is that project-based learning sort of is performing arts, or rather performing arts and the arts really sit at the heart of this kind of creativity. So when I went to School 21, they showed, I went and looked around an exhibition that they had set up. This was their final product of their World War I project. And it was absolutely extraordinary. It kind of blew my mind. Let me describe it to you. They had taken over a series of about 4 different classroom spaces in the upstairs of the school. And they had converted these into a narrative that went through the beginning of the First World War right to the end, and it looked at it through various aspects. They had built a huge trench and signs. They had created the world of the trenches in one of the rooms, a trench that you could walk through, and all the signs to the different places around the trench that you would have found in Ypres and the Somme. They did artwork varying from kind of traditional art forms to the highly abstracted. They looked at contemporary resonance of conflict, child soldiers and how those existed in the First World War and how they exist today, and sort of youth and those aspects, and myriad other pieces of art that I could share with you. They looked at sculpture and installation. And obviously all the time was studying artists as inspiration to make their pieces of artwork. They each had to, as their first commission, create a portrait of a particular soldier, an imagined character. From that imagined character, they wrote a poem each. And all of this work was exhibited as part of the exhibition as well. There was academic work from different subjects exhibited. Here we've got some historical analysis about the causes of World War I displayed in essays as part of the exhibition. Stuff to do with the different areas of Europe, history, geography, but also an artistic take on it. Letters and compositions from character perspectives and building empathy. And essays from English and composed poetry, all displayed. There was even an app that the students had designed such that when you came to visit the exhibition as a member of the public or as a parent or as one of the invited guests, you could download the app and you could have it as a sort of tour guide and all the information that you needed. And there was a student group who were assigned to developing that app. There were people who were assigned to be tour guides, and they gave a lecture at the start or the end based on the causes of the war, its consequences. They talked you through the exhibition. They became an expert on everything in the exhibition to bring it to life, a little bit like a guide or an audio guide or a tour guide. There were innumerable other things. There were baked biscuits, there were medals, there was bunting, and it all stretched this top floor of this school building. And of course, at the center of it were performances. And in each space, there was at least one character who had composed a monologue from their historical knowledge, who would tell you about their experience, their fictionalized or factionalized experience of the war. There were also more engaged and extravagant performances based on movement, involving projections and physical theatre. And there were dramatized scenes between people, which were from devising and also from teacher scripting. So I was naturally absolutely blown away. And if you look at sort of it as an entire plan, this is what it was, that you would come in through this door and be briefed on the build up to war and all the attitudes around that. You would come in to see Paths of Glory, the kind of jingoistic, patriotic lead up to the First World War and the recruiting drive. And then you would come into this sort of winter of the first of sort of 1914-15, when the troops had dug in and the trenches were created. And that was that picture that I showed you there. And then on to Zone D, the front line, and all of the considerations that went with life on as being a soldier, and again, academic work, poetry, art, all created and related to that. Zone E, the consequences, and then in the final sort of section, there was a place to kind of pause and reflect. Really extravagant, probably took about 45 minutes to go around the whole thing. And some extraordinary things happened. Of course, this had a link to the real world because dignitaries from the territorial army and from the local community, including the mayor of Newham, came to take in the work. And you had students who previously weren't that engaged in performing arts or in other art forms, who had become little experts and learned from their friends and from their peers about the exhibition, and were able to show these people around and go into detail about aspects of history and aspects of the work created. This young man had previously not shown any engagement really at all in any aspect of work, but was there from 3:30 until 6 every day in the art department over those 2 weeks, building that trench, and through it absorbing all of the related content and subject knowledge around the exhibition, and came away with a robust knowledge of the war and its various different aspects. Again, another example there of a monologue taking place. So back to my problem, which was I had been asked to create this performing arts-based project commemorating the First World War and exploring resonance for the world today. How do I go about it? Well, I was very mindful that this was a primarily visual arts exhibition. And of course, there was a performance aspect of it. But I did want to build cross-curricular links, but I definitely wanted to place performing arts more at the center of it. So I created, with the director of music and I had a little bit of budget to bring in some external practitioners, some local actors and people who'd worked with the school, something called Remember. And this was a year 8 project, and we had about 12 hours worth of lesson time over the start of autumn term to try and create this experience for an audience. And it included the following aspects. there was a series of spaces around the school site which ended in the theatre, which again related the narrative of the war. So I stuck to that. We had the build up to war, the glorious summer of 1914, in a nice open room with some lovely warm lighting. We had bunting, and we had music playing, and we had projections, and we had all of that positive feeling around it. And then we moved on. These audience were ushered into another room where they were recruited, and they went through the experience of what it would have been like to have heard a recruitment speech and how they would have progressed from there. And then it went to another space where we saw the first winter in Ypres, and I think that was on the AstroTurf, and we saw, like, you know, it was actually in the pouring rain, and we saw poetry being read out and a dramatized scene between a number of soldiers around the time that the football match was happening on Christmas Eve between the Germans and the English. And then there was another site, and then there was a pause for remembrance, and there were sort of these 5 or 6 spaces, and the students ushered people from the audience from one space to the next. As I said, it followed the narrative of the World War I. And the content, I'd say, was a mixture of devised scenes and also teacher written scenes. And I want to talk a bit about that later, about how much sort of editorial control and democratic intention there is behind the way that these processes work. But I was mindful that we didn't have an awful lot of time, and we therefore it erred more towards teachers writing scenes and the children kind of performing them. And then around us were some exhibits of work from other subjects. Just like in that other exhibition, there were some essays on the wall, there was some artwork, there was some self-composed poetry, etc. Here are a few little photos from it. We've got a student ushering people in to watch the next bit of the exhibition and performance. We've got some exhibited work, and we've got the rain on the AstroTurf. And you can see they were all wearing these t-shirts, each with a fictional character that they had sort of researched on there. So sort of quite Brechtian in that sense. What did I discover doing it? Well, I discovered that other departments in the school weren't very supportive when I suggested that we do this project. And I said to the history teacher, how about you get together a display of work for this? And could we be doing some work on historical figures that might help their dramatic creations? And I didn't get too supportive a response. I did get a very supportive response from the music department. English department, would they be interested in helping us to write some poetry that might feature in the performance? Again, a bit of reluctance, but we'll come on to that later. Decision making. Yes, I felt that we erred too much on the side of teacher directed decision making rather than the children kind of autonomously creating their own work. Let's talk more about that later, because I think that's the big key question that this all turns on. However, at the same time, we found that the audience engagement through this new way of working around the school and moving around the school was transformed, as opposed to being in a theatre. And I think if you view the piece that we created, and indeed the example from School 21, as a piece of art, it really was. And all art is, as we know, is a prop for a conversation. This extended the conversation between students and between adults about what was being created far more than I think I have ever seen in a traditional school play in a theatre. There was something about that process of parents and visitors having to engage in walking around and take responsibility for their own space and their own journey through that environment, which made them sit up and engage in it far more. And likewise for the students themselves, they stepped up massively in the final 2 days. I was amazed. That wasn't the case in the early build up to it, because I think that there was a sense in which they couldn't really visualize what we were working towards until they saw really what was going to happen, until they were handed over the keys to the space that they were putting their section of the performance in. And when that happened, we found that people who had previously not been interested in performing arts at all started taking responsibility for dressing the space, for putting up signs, for finding ways to get sound into the space and put sound effects, for bringing in little practical lights and household lanterns and torches to make the space space atmospheric, and to brushing up on the historical facts so that they could really educate the audience about it. Again, not the sort of behavior and ownership that I had ever seen when I had been directing a more traditional production at school. So let's take us back one more time to another imagined scenario. And this is where I'd like you to get involved. We've had a look at this example of World War I, but let's imagine that we now have to undertake this task. We've been asked to create a performing arts-based creative response to the subject of lockdown, fresh in our minds. The project should explore the events, thoughts, feelings, experiences, and lessons from the last year. How do you go about it? Well, yesterday I got on the phone to the head of art at School 21, and I asked him to rack his brains to this event, which was, I think, about 6 or 7 years ago. And I said, how did you approach that project? Because I saw the end point, that amazing exhibition that you created, but I don't know how it actually came about. I'm assuming it didn't just happen. And I wanted to ask him about how much autonomy the students had, how it was planned, and how it all was created. What can we learn from their process? This is what I discovered. There were a few steps to this process. Number one was to build empathy. Now, he said, if you want to get children involved in project-based learning, it is so easy just to go immediately to what we need to create, to the end product. But actually, if you don't have a hook on which the children can link their reason for why they should care about the subject at hand, you're kind of onto a loser. So he said, the first thing we did was build empathy. Well, what did they do to build empathy? They took all the children into the school hall and they read out testimony from the football match between the Germans and the English in no man's land on that first Christmas night during the First World War. And they turned all the lights out and they had different students reading out different things, and then they reenacted that scene as best they could. And an extraordinary thing happened, was the children were able to relate. Sorry, empathy is misspelled, I've just seen. The children were able to relate to the idea of football, a lot of them. The kinesthetic process of putting them in that environment transformed their empathy to the subject matter, which previously had been kind of vague and historical, and now was far more immediate because of the way it was done. So I wonder, how could we build empathy around this subject of lockdown? If we needed to do this project, a performing arts response to lockdown, how could we build empathy? Whilst you're thinking about that, and if you have any ideas, I'd encourage you to pop them in the chat. I've got a few suggestions to get us going. Maybe students could compose personal responses to how their family has been affected by the pandemic. Obviously a risky thing and something that would need to be conducted safely, but it is a unique subject in that it has affected absolutely everyone. And talking about that and finding a safe way to channel that for the children could be a major source of some material that then finds its way, I would say, into a performance, or at least inspiration for further discussion about performance. Could it be a case of reading or watching testimonies of people who have been close to the front line or have been survivors of the pandemic in some way? People who have suffered or experienced lockdown in different ways. Could you bring in a witness, someone who had worked in a hospital or someone who has been involved in another way for the young people to gain inspiration from? As I said, any other thoughts about how we could build that first initial empathy for the subject and why we should create a project about it for young people? Do pop them in the chat as we go along. Now, the second stage of the process that I discovered from School 21 was about the project brief. This is where you really talk to the students about what it is that they are going to create. You make them see it and feel it and visualize it to the best of your ability. And the project brief really describes the process and it describes what they're working towards. So this was School 21's one. They said, in this project, you will research and learn about the conflicts in the First World War. You will use this understanding to produce artwork that will be part of an opening exhibition based on the inquiry title, What Were the Conflicts in World War I, at the end of spring term. So in that, you've got the inquiry question, you've got what they're leading towards, and you've got the process that they're going to be undertaking for that. So my question for you is, what could our project brief be? What would be the process or journey that we would outline to the students? We've built their empathy up. We know that they know that they're going to create something about lockdown and why they should care about it. And now we're telling them about what it is that they're going to create. So what kind of process or journey of learning would we outline to them? And what would be the final product or outcome? You know, is it going to be like the World War I thing, a series of different classrooms that the audience are led through for an immersive performance? Or is it going to be in one location? Or is it going to be something that's multi-visual? You know, does it involve recorded content, filmed content, particularly topical now with restrictive visiting, you know, permissions in schools, and live performance? Is it going to involve some art? What would be the inquiry question embedded into that? What are, you know, an example inquiry question might be, what are our responses to lockdown? And who are the audience? Is it just parents, or are you going to be inviting some particular people or dignitaries who've been affected by the pandemic? And that kind of leads me on to the real world impact. If you can tie the project or the production to some kind of impact on the real world, for example, at School 21, they invited in the Territorial Army, and it was about sort of changing hearts and minds and saying, you know, as a community, we care about what you do and we care about the history that we're all part of. Or is it about bringing in local politicians and saying, look, this is our personal response to COVID and the lockdown, and these are the things that we feel how we were affected, and for local politicians to see that. And is that something, because I think the more that you can build that shared sense of the project being bigger than just the performance, and also the real world impact, the impact on changing hearts and minds that this project will have, the more of a shared purpose you're going to be building from that. So my question to you, just on this, to kind of bring some of this together, and I just love people to jump in the chat, is what cross-curricular links might be possible for our lockdown project? In particular, beyond performance, how could other departments or subjects be involved? So if I was just to get the ball rolling on that, is it that in English, poetry is composed, which could feature in the performance as a response to people's feelings on lockdown? Jump in the chat and just type in anything that springs to mind from any other department, any other subject that could form part of this project. Okay, step 3 of the process for School 21 was allocating roles, and these were some of the example roles that they allocated. There was an exhibition designer for their World War I project, so was responsible for completing a number of artistic commissions set by the curator, who was the person who leads on the look and the feel of the exhibition, providing an overall structure. I'll talk more about them in a minute. So an exhibition designer, they might be creating those portraits that we were talking about. They might be building the trench, or they might be creating different artworks. You could have been a historian in this process, so someone who had a strong understanding of the causes and consequences of World War I and the human stories affecting individuals and communities. Now, this role would have involved developing knowledge and understanding to create a meaningful and historically accurate exhibition. So they'd be the ones who might be writing essays or collating stuff that might feature a part of the academic part of the exhibition. And an exhibition guide, we talked about, people who showed visitors around the exhibition and became experts on everything in there and delivered a sort of lecture about it. And what they did was they had a project outcome for each one of those roles. It said what that role involved. It wasn't left completely loose. It said, okay, we've got, for the exhibition designer, you will be creating a plan for the exhibition. You will also be doing 3 pieces of artwork, 3 commissions. You will be writing a personal response, and you'll be doing your own commission from some sort of, you know, making your own piece of artwork independently, and etc. So it was a really carefully codified what those roles included. So I wonder, again, jump in the chat, if ours is a more performing arts-based project rather than a purely fine art-based project, what project roles could we have in this? Maybe some of them will be the same, but what might be? We've got all of this amazing cross-curricular content we want to exhibit, and we've got all this learning that's taken place. So what roles could students take on to bring this project to fruition. An example might be a script editor. So if there are improvised scenes being created, one young person might have responsibility for overseeing the, I don't know, grammatical accuracy. A producer or event manager, Alex says. Great. I think there's other things linked to that, isn't there? Set designer, sound producer. And just going back to a producer or event manager, we've got lighting. We could have work on box office or ticketing, couldn't we? Or marketing. We've got a stage manager, health and safety manager. Yeah, absolutely. Someone who monitors that. Any other thoughts in there? And of course, there's more specific creative roles, aren't there? You could have an actor, you know, there could be several actors. There could be people who are involved in creating fine art around the piece. You know, maybe it is a more artistically integrated project, sort of something between my Remember project and the School 21 one. Prop maker, yeah, great. Design roles for promotion. Yes, so designing marketing material, I think is what Emma's getting at. And researcher, evaluator, yeah, the people who become the evaluator, sorry, separate. So researcher, obviously on the content, doing that statistical work or whatever, and an evaluator, how do we evaluate the impact of this and figuring that out? All real world life skills, particularly if you're going for a career in the performing arts, evaluating your impact. Ushers, creative digital media manager, yeah, or an app builder or whatever. Now, the fourth part of the process that they said was really allowing for risks to be taken, but also creating structures. And this is where I think the teacher who I was talking to yesterday said that he's allocated these roles to all his students, but at the same time, that meant casting himself in a role as well. And what he decided to say, he said, I'm going to work with the available skills that I've got. This is the first year of School 21. This is there's a lot of children who have come from schools where it hasn't been working out for them because it's a new free school. We have got raw artistic creativity. We have got ability to communicate. We have got stickability and passion, but we might not have as many skills on craft as we perhaps need. So how am I going to build that in, and how am I going to allow them the maximum autonomy whilst making sure that they develop something that's really coherent? Because if I have full democracy, he thought, we might not quite get anywhere. So he decided that he was going to cast himself as the project curator, the real artistic decider. And he said that as part of that, he developed a structure. He said this exhibition is going to have an important top level message that all parts of the exhibition must be relevant to. So there's like one headline impact that he wants. And similarly, each zone has a zone key message which links to the top level message. This was his kind of structure. And so, for example, in zone A, which was just outside that network of classrooms, the key message was about the start of the war. It says the start of World War I was widely believed to have been triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but the tensions in Europe had been building up for a long time. The war involves conflicts between empires and desire to expand into new territories. This has led to a military arms race between nations, fostering a culture of fear. So all the work in that section related to that key message historically, and that sort of thing they wanted to get across. And within that, then, there were, those who were on the artist's role within that zone had their commissions, which were to, for example, develop an expressive drawing of a soldier and write a piece of personal writing. And that was part of that zone which came up. Or you might have had history essays. So that kind of broke down further into the specific tasks. And what it ended up with was this zone, all these different zones, which all had a different impact and a different kind of theme, but they all built up into that top level message. So you might have, for example, down here, exhibit message was a set of essays on the causes of the First World War. Here was what was happening historically with the empire, blah, 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 blah. All of these fed up into each zone having a different message, and it fed up into a top level message. And that head of art was the curator for keeping control of that kind of continuity and that overall system with the whole thing. So this kind of brings to an end, really, this section, but I just wanted to just run through the overall debrief that I had with them and their overall points. They said it is crucial, if you're doing a project like this, to work backwards, like we would all do if we were directing a play or we were making an exhibition. In other words, really think about the end product, what you want it to look like, what you want it to feel like, and what experience you want audiences to have with it when they encounter it. And that's something we do naturally as practitioners, but it is not necessarily something that all other subject teachers do, which I'm going to talk a bit more about. As part of that thinking, really, what knowledge needs to be in place in order to do this? If you're going to be asking them to develop artwork or poetry around the subject of World War I or devise scenes, they're going to need certain historical knowledge. So when does that take place? Is it happening in lessons simultaneously, or has it happened the term before? And then in this term, you are then building on that knowledge foundation. So really thinking about what is your pre-production for whatever project this is, what is your production period, and what is the performance period, and when are those timed? They had another project at School 21 where they were going to be looking at sort of Russian absurdist theatre, and they in art developed these amazing huge Modrock heads that the actors were going to wear as costume, but unfortunately they only got finished a week before the performance. So when it came to the performance, they used them, but they weren't really using them that well. What they really needed to be was they needed to be using them from the beginning of rehearsal. So they needed to be doing that a term before. So just having that sense of the plan, and if you're doing a cross-curricular activity, what subjects are going to be involved at what stage, I think is crucial. Ways of thinking. As I said, we artistically as practitioners think very much endpoint related, but we are also very comfortable with innovation and experimentation. That is not always the case for a head of history or a head of English. And making sure that if you want to build a coalition of cross-curricular consensus, you're talking to them in the right way, but also saying, okay, it's a very discrete task. This is the reason why I think we should do it. And it's not as frightening, because they will come up with all sorts of reasons why it's not a good idea to get involved on an innovative basis. And I think taking that away from them and making it a safe space in order to contribute to, and rather than a sort of, well, I don't know, anything could happen kind of space, is perhaps a way that I would have got more luck if I had, and that's how I would do things differently now if I was reapproaching my project. Also, think about the experience of your collaborators. You know, what I have outlined is not an easy thing necessarily to do. And I don't suspect necessarily that an NQT could just pick this project up or a project like this and develop something like School 21 developed. I think a lot of these teachers who went on this were really quite experienced and looking to push their practice. But that doesn't mean that you can't have one who's a really good lead, who's really delegating very thoroughly and in detail about it. But I think just being mindful of your experience of your collaborators and therefore what it's reasonable to expect in terms of an end product. Finally, everybody is learning on this project, including the teachers. And there is no shame in something cross-curricular in saying, you know what, we're going to develop this immersive performance experience. I've never worked in an immersive performance environment, but look, here's someone from Punch Drunk who's going to come and talk to us. And I'm going to learn from them as well as you. But of course, secretly, you're thinking to yourself as a teacher, my capacity for learning is probably a bit greater than my students. So I'm going to be able to use that material a bit more than they might in the service of what we're creating together. So really just having, but not being afraid to think everybody is learning, and experts can sometimes be a great way of, or an exhibition curator from the Science Museum, if you were doing something more fine art based, Also have one leader. Running a project with 2 people of equal standing is very hard. With 5 people of equal standing is very, very hard. One person for whom there's accountability, who has the vision and who is driving things forward and calling those meetings and making final decisions, regardless of how much autonomy you're giving students, making sure that there's one person who's signing off and making decisions on things. And also building consensus around the project as a journey, by which I mean it's okay to take risks and it's okay to fail. This is a journey-based thing, and having the support of your SLT to say, you know what, it's about the learning that's taking place through the project. And of course, we hope the final production or product will be excellent, but it doesn't need to be for it to have benefited the students. And building collaborations takes time. You know, if this is something where an English teacher and a history teacher and a music teacher need to be involved the term before you start making it, then you need to be talking to them perhaps a year in advance, you know, and thinking about. So, but that's all a question of degree. Maybe there are more limited ways people can get involved. But the benefits, I think, if this kind of work is able to be pulled off, it making something leads to expertise. We really know that, rather than memorizing knowledge. We know that by making a play or acting a part, you become an expert in elements of craft and the knowledge of what you're presenting and the subject matter that you're presenting. Writing a poem, writing an essay crafting it leads to expertise. Also, children teach each other, and where you might have a role that is specific to the academic angle and another child that is specific to the creative angle, they will learn from each other because they've got that empathy and that curiosity, and they will find out knowledge from each other just by being around the project. Curiosity is central, because if you don't have curiosity about the subject, you're not going to want to learn about it. And I think that's where project-based learning comes into its own, because it really builds that curiosity. A project like this creates shared enthusiasm for the project. That is all for the subject matter. And that's all linked to it having a final endpoint rather than an exam, and an audience and a real world impact that you are going to deliver. Art as a prop for conversation. Yeah, this, whatever it is, this performance, this exhibition, it will extend that conversation between two different generations. And you look at it, you admire the beauty of it, whether it's a performance or a piece of art, and then you talk about it afterwards. That's what art does. And finally, it engages all skill set. It engages the child who doesn't want to stand up on stage, but might be comfortable ushering or dressing the set. And it also engages the artist or the academic who wants to write the essay or be the tour guide. And it also engages the young artist who wants to be a performer. And finally, it builds community. This is all about building community within a year group or within a cohort. So back to our inquiry question for us to think about for the rest of the session. You've been asked to create a performing arts-based creative response to lockdown. The project should explore the events, thoughts, feelings, experiences, and lessons from the last year. How do you go about it?
I really want to move on and think about set design in the context of what we've been looking at, but also to think about the set and the design not just as a little add-on that we tag on at the end of a project, or not just as a pretty backdrop that we put behind what we've got our performers working on. Actually something that's really integral into this type of process. I have to be honest, it would be a dream of mine to see more theatre made in this way, where as designers we were invited into the rehearsal room at an earlier stage, or actually where we were invited into a devising process at an earlier stage, so that we have a say and an influence on the way a play is devised. I think as designers, generally speaking, we have a really good sense of space and how space can be used. I think we're generally pretty good at with our use of colour and what that can mean. And sometimes writers can tie us up in knots, to be honest with you, because they might turn around and get so specific about the colour of something. You know, they may refer to the colour of a dress because they thought that was going to work nicely. But in actual fact, in the context of the period or in the context of creating a whole visual, that can actually be a real problem. So sometimes it would be great as a designer to be involved in an early process. And it's why I'd like to encourage all practitioners, so whether you're coming at this from an art point of view or performing arts point of view, just to really think about your visual storytelling right from the start. So yeah, it's great to start. It's great to start with words. It's great to start with a script. That's traditionally how we work. But you know, start with give some time early on in your process to thinking about the elements that people see that tell the story before they even heard a word uttered. Actually, before I go too far off on that, I think it's really important we think about spaces and the kind of spaces that we could be performing in and the kind of arrangements. I know for some of you this is probably very familiar, but I'd like to whiz through the different types of performance spaces that we're used to within theatre. So if I can just share my screen. And as I'm doing this, think about where in your school or where that your school has available to you to use, might some of these scenarios be available to you. Okay, so what most of us, I think, probably have to deal with in school is some kind of proscenium or end on stage, and that's what we would traditionally use. Maybe the school hall, theatre, a studio space that we would put the audience on and facing the theatre. I have to be honest, I have experience of school productions where that is absolutely rubbish as well, because it creates such a bad relationship between the audience and the actor, because the floor is flat and the stage isn't raised very high, because otherwise if people would fall off the front and it would be really dangerous. So the parents queue up outside for 40 minutes, for an hour, even longer, so that they can get the first seat and to the front row of seats, so they can actually see their kids. Meanwhile, the people who are 25 rows back, trying to peer between all the other heads, don't get to see the people who are taking part in the production. So throughout all of this, all the decisions you are making about where to go, what spaces to use, I'd really love you to think about the relationship between the audience and the actor or your performers, because that's what theatre's about, isn't it? It's about creating a dynamic between someone who's come to see something and someone who is performing that for them, with all the supporting other material around them. Okay, so a slight adaptation on that then is we've got our thrust stage. So I've got the Crucible Theatre there for us to see, one of my favourite buildings to work in and to go and see things, because you get close to the performance. And again, if you're working, actually, I'm going to move on very quickly into in the round. So Stephen Joseph Theatre and the Royal Exchange there. If you can get more audience members around your stage, you have less issues to do with needing to have rate seating, because you can just put 2 or 3 rows around your stage and people will be able to see. They'll also be able to hear, because they're not miles away from the stage. So in the round, thrust theatre can be really practical for school environments. Traverse can work quite nicely as well, obviously, where you've got your stage down the middle and audience on both sides. And finally, a lot of what we've been looking at today involves Promenade, which is great. It requires your audience to come and be very actively involved. It might require you to set up lots of different scenes going on that they will move around. Those can happen at the same time. So they'll move on from one to the other. So, for example, those 2 bottom pictures there, the rather weird scientisty type one, and the World War II home, that was from a production I did at the Crucible quite a number of years ago. It was a Promenade production that was around various areas of the building. So in actual fact, that white room is in the green room of the theatre. And that little World War II room is what is now the cafe at the Crucible. And it was a Promenade piece, and there were I think 4 or 5 performances going on at the same time, and the audience moved around. It allows you to have a bigger audience seeing lots of different things that are happening at the same time. I should also say one of our other performance venues on that particular day was the ladies' toilets. Not sure that's best for school, but nonetheless, it was quite an interesting place for performance to take place. So what I've got there now are 3 examples of where I've been into different where we've taken over different spaces to put in something that's not necessarily a conventional performance for that space. So a couple of years ago, I worked on Coram Boy at Nottingham, with Nottingham Playhouse. They took over the Albert Hall next door, which is very much a concert venue. It's not a performance venue, and it suffers a little bit from that scenario I was talking about, having that flat floor and then not being able to see your audience. So in that scenario, we put a raked stage up, a raked stage on the front there, so that by the time the performers are stood on it, they're kind of being projected up towards the audience. That helped to a certain extent. The second one there was a total blank canvas, which I guess what some of you will hopefully be working with, maybe not on this scale. This was a massive warehouse in Sheffield, which we were putting on a production of 1984. So we had to bring in the seats. We came up with this semi-thrust arrangement and on a background that actually resembled the Park Hill Flats in Sheffield. But again, you can see from the top to the bottom the transformation of that space as a found space, effectively, to put theatre into. And then the last one there, which is I put there because it was a really low budget production. It was one of those productions. In actual fact, I was told I had no budget. It was down to finding objects. So we managed to find an old floor that we could paint the back of, found some fabric strips that we could rip up. But also we were doing it at Theatre Delhi, which had in Sheffield, which had an end-on arrangement, and we just asked them very nicely if we could reconfigure their seating blocks and made it into a thrust arrangement. So again, we could get the audience in much closer and close in around the individual performer, because that was actually really important in that particular scenario. Okay, so that whizzes me through. Let me stop the share. That whizzes through different stage layouts. And so hopefully already there you're starting to think about different spaces in school. And I think what Will has shared with us is really interesting as well, about going through different environments. I love the idea of school-based promenade performance, immersive performance, and I think that's great for design and art as well, to be particularly prominent in the decision making. There's obviously lots of practicalities to sort out. How you move people around a setup like that, how you move them around safely. Therefore, the number of kids you bring in, the number of students you bring in as stewards, and that kind of thing. How you make sure it's safe, how you make sure when they're moving around from classroom to classroom, you're creating a safe environment. What you do if there's in terms of fire procedures, or things that need to be checked out before you actually embark on the performance, getting involved various members of various stakeholders in the school, like senior management, like your caretakers, just getting everyone to buy into it so that you can kind of make that type of theatre work. But it might be that you're going to be stuck in the same venue that you're always stuck in. It might be that you're stuck in the school hall. And if that's the case, even then, try and think if there's a different way you could do it, rather than doing the big nightmare scenario that I've talked about, where the parents can't see. Is there a way you could put it into the round or something that would just reimagine that space and allow you to give a different type of performance for your school and its community? Obviously, you've got to consider your limitations as well. It's great to be ambitious, but you've got to bring into account your budget and the people that you can rope in to help you. But I think when you're starting out on a project, it's really important to be as ambitious as you can be, and kind of dream big and rein it in if you have to, and put the feelers out. So you'll see who will come and who will help. As I say, I was one of those members of staff that the feeler was put out to, and I did go and help. And there were members of the science department that were great with lighting. There were members of the science department that made great stage management as well. So put those calls out there, see where you can get help from. I kind of want to run through a few activities now, and 3 activities that encourage you to think about putting design at the centre of a devising process. And there are also activities that you could do with students themselves as well. So I've kind of tried to put them into a digital form, but they're things that I have done in workshops before that actually communicate quite nicely some quite good design principles. So whether you're doing something traditional or whether or not you're doing something that's less traditional. And I think a lot of it comes down to thinking about, and the phrase I'm going to keep reusing, is thinking about that relationship between the audience and the actor. I was always taught that it was really important as a designer to make sure that you facilitate actors to be able to perform. And I think as the years have gone over, I've realized that's actually, it's not just about them performing, it's about them being able to have that relationship, audience and actor and audience. Okay, so let me go back and let me explain the activity first. And it's something you could easily run with a group of students, and that's to take a couple of chairs and to get them to start to put them in just to come out in turn and just to put those 2 chairs in different arrangements within the room. So get them either stood in a line or stood in the middle of a space, and then they will love trying to be the most original person they can be and to put those chairs in the most original way they can possibly be. And sometimes they miss the most obvious and simple things because of that. But at the end of that, to get them to think about what those chairs say to somebody who, well, imagine Let me put it a different way. Imagine those chairs are on a stage, and you walk in and you sit down in your seat, or you stand around and you see that setup there. What does that particular arrangement of chairs say to you? And obviously, this is something that you can do on any kind of budget. So it can be poor theatre, or it can be something that's incorporated into something that is much bigger. So I've got some chair arrangements to show you. I'd like you to think about what they say to you, what they symbolize as you see each arrangement. And then at the end, I'll get you again to pop into the chat just a couple of thoughts on some of those arrangements that you see. So let's go and share again. Testing my screen sharing capabilities this afternoon. Okay, so 2 chairs. Number 1. So child number 2 might come up and give you a different arrangement, something like that. Child number 3. Participant number 4. Number 5. Number 6. Okay, so there they are all together. What do those different layouts say to you might be occurring? So say that is the start of a play. What does that say to you might be happening? If you could just shove some thoughts in the chat, just give us a number and say what you think could be happening, what the background to the story is. I'm trying to find chat. Okay, great. So we've got, so for example, number 1, it's a waiting room. And also number 1, solidarity, people in something together, again, togetherness. Number 6 is more like an interview, an interrogation. Number 1, also a park bench. Number 4, conflict or argument. Number 4, an argument. There's a sense that something not great has happened just before we've walked into the space. Number 4, mismatch. Number 2, an interview, an interrogation. Number 6, isolation. Relationship. Number 3, end of school. Yeah, brilliant. Sorry, I've moved my chat up. Number 4, conflict. Number 5, sleep. Great. Number 5, barricades. I've had that one before, and someone said something a bit like a boat, you know. And if we're using our chairs in a way that aren't representative of just being chairs, they can become anything. Okay, I'm just going to bring us back. And there's times where you want to take those thoughts about chairs, and you want to be quite specific about what that chair is. So if that is now the part of a design that is going to be, I don't know, a bigger, more complete room, you want to think about what that specific chair is. What, you know, so we're saying something about the time period, we're saying something about the status of the person. But if you are doing something that is very episodic, and you're going from one scenario to the next, sometimes you actually want a really bland chair so that it can easily become something else rather than being too rooted in one particular thing. So something I kind of want to bring out of that little activity is, people will go in and they will read a setup on a stage, and you're starting to give them some kind of visual storytelling through that immediately. But as someone I was going to say as a designer, but as somebody creating work where you're thinking about the visual storytelling, you want to think carefully about what that chair is. And that's not necessarily about getting the right chair for the right scene. That might be about getting the right chair that allows you to bridge a whole number of scenes and that will work together and can be an object, not just a chair. So just something to think about at the start, about what kind of language are we setting up with our props, with our furniture, and how we're gonna move that, how we're gonna carry that through. Okay, second little exercise I would like to look at, and again, this is something you can do in a classroom or in a studio environment, is to gather together a group of objects and to get people to start to write down the story that group of objects starts to tell. So I'm going to give you, I'm going to start off with 2 objects, and I'm going to add in other objects as we go. After each one, just scribble it. If you've got a piece of paper and a pen, scribble it down. I don't think this needs to go in the chat. But I would like you, after the first picture goes up, just create a lift. I'll give you a minute or so in between each picture going up. I'd like you to think about who is the character in this that we're setting up here. When did they live? What do they do? Is there anything else that you might think about them that's worth jotting down? And then, as I put up the second picture, think about, does that character change? Has what's been put into that picture changed it at all? You may need to go back. I'm going to be a bit mean actually on one of them. So you may need to go back to the start, to scratch, and come up with a totally new character. But it's really getting us to think about, when we place an object on a stage, what I do all the time. When I place something on a stage, what are the audience going to read into that? What stories are we starting to tell visually before a word has even been spoken? Okay, so let's share the screen again. Okay, so two objects, got an old book and a pair of glasses. Just think about who that character could be, when they might have lived. Any other story that is interesting, any kind of background that is interesting. Okay, so I'll bring in the second image. And that may develop your character for you. That may take you off in a totally different tangent. Okay, and I'll bring up the next picture, the next one. Okay, and I'll bring up the final one. Okay, so as I said, I thought I was probably been a little bit mean when somebody introduced the palettes, particularly, and then perhaps even meaner when I brought in the laptop. But it's just I think it's just to really highlight that as soon as you put a group of objects together, you start to tell a story. And I think we got quite comfy with the book and the glasses and the violin, and we're starting to create a nice character. And then suddenly we've created a total. And I don't know what that scenario is with the palettes and then the laptop either. But it's interesting, when you put a group of objects together, you are already starting to tell a story. So I think it's a privilege as a designer to have a preset, so that in actual fact, when an audience comes in and they're starting to look at something, we've already started to tell the story before an actor has even walked onto the stage. And so when you are thinking about the spaces you are using in school, and if you are thinking about people walking into a promenade type space, or whether you're talking about having something in the round, what you put on the stage, whether that's an arrangement of two chairs or whether there's any other objects that go with that, you are already into the visual storytelling aspect of your production. And people will start to clock it and start to make up their scenarios of what's going on. And actually, I noticed it the other day. I was watching Louis Theroux's his documentary with Joe Exotic, and I have to be honest, I was expecting to go in and find out where Joe Exotic was at the moment, and we had a load of historical stuff that Louis had recorded with Joe Exotic a long time ago. And they did a really clever thing just to suddenly let us know that we were coming up to date. And it was Louis Theroux walking into his hotel room with a face mask on. And suddenly, with one image, we'd time placed everything. We weren't in the historical Joe Exotic anymore. We were suddenly being brought up to the now, because obviously the face mask was just so now, it couldn't have been from any other time. So again, a nice little bit of visual storytelling in that documentary. Did you all get the message about bringing some different colour items? So have you got a red item? Could you hold it up right in front of your camera screen? Right in front of your camera, please. So what we've got there is a range of different reds, great range of different red items. And again, this is something you could easily do in a classroom. You get your students to bring in a range of found objects. Let's go through our green objects. If you've got something, if you haven't, don't panic. Hold it up nice and close to the screen so we can get another screen. Picture, please. Brilliant. Nice range of greens going on there. Move on to yellows. Magic, thank you. Violet. I'm not doing these in any particular order. Oh, that's a nice arrangement. I like. I'm a big fan of purple. Violet. Sorry. Great. Don't like Parma violet. Sorry. Personal taste. What haven't we done? We haven't done blue. Brilliant, brilliant. Very good. Like the champagne. Orange. This one's probably a bit mean if you hadn't got it to hand beforehand because there's not so many orange things. And finally, indigo. I struggled a bit here. Super. Great. Now, obviously, if you had a classroom or a class of people, you could do a really nice thing where you actually get them then to try and sort them into a massive color wheel. And rather than seeing all those lovely greens and all those lovely purples, actually trying to get them to grade them in color. So what goes from the bluest purple through, or the bluest indigo through into blue, and then moving on as we go through the different colors. So looking again between our yellows and our greens, getting our greeny yellows and then our greeny blues going into the blue. And there's ways in which you can do it that are quite fun in making them do it in silence. So in actual fact, you end up with people moving things around that other people will totally disagree with because our perception of colour can be quite different. But it's a fun activity, and it also encourages people to think again carefully about the choices that they make. It's very easy to turn around and say, oh, that's got to be orange or that's got to be blue. But there's a million blues and there's a million oranges, and finding the right colour and the right combinations of colour is so important. It's so important as a designer. But that also leads on into conversations to do with texture and choice of other objects. It's about being real careful decision makers, so that in our productions we create the best looking things that we can. Okay, so there's an example I found online of something that tries to grade the colours a little bit as you go around the different objects. I mean, I think it looks beautiful. It wasn't the. I can remember doing this in a big room full of people, and it was more impressive than that. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of that though. But also, just talking about millions of colours, I read a script once where it talked about having two teams of people. It had a red team and a green team, and this was immediately one of those scenarios where I was cursing the writer because why tie me into a red team and a green team? That's really frustrating. And then I took a step back and thought, well, hang on a minute. A red team and a green team can be interpreted in many different ways. And so you've got a whole screen there of pairs of reds and greens. And I think that some of them you would think are really contemporary interpretations of red and green, and some of them, if you were going to do something that was set in World War II, for example, might be a much better representation of red and green. So just because, despite what I've said about being frustrated by people dictating what colour has to be, just because someone has said that, don't feel that it has to be a particular way. Bring your own interpretation to things, and there's always ways to find ways of making colour work for you. But it's all about making, or from my point of view as a designer, and if you're taking on that particular kind of role within creating a production, creating a set, and those decisions, making good decisions about the overall look of something is really, really important. So that goes right through. So let me just stop sharing my screen because it's been a bit of a whiz through set design. That goes right through from deciding what space you're going to be using and how you're going to use that space. So whether we're talking about something that's a thrust, a promenade, or an in the round, whatever, through to the decisions you need to make about how furniture is arranged. Or one more quick example I want to drop in there is imagine for some reason your classroom is being portrayed as part of a play, and it's an end-on production. The way you stage that depends on what is important to be seen in that particular scene. So it might be that you want to stage it with the teacher facing out towards the audience because what the teacher is saying is important. It might be that you want to turn that 180 degrees round because in actual fact what the teacher is saying might be important, but in actual fact what is more important is the reaction from the students. So always think, and this again comes back to audience and actor relationship. What do you want the audience to see from your actors? Do you want them to see the teacher and what the teacher's saying? Do you want them to see the reaction from the group of children, the group of students sat in front of them? So as you approach your staging and your design, think about what is important for the audience to see. Think about what is important for them to see in terms of objects. So you're setting up a really good visual storytelling language, and then take that right through to detailed decisions to do with color and texture, because all of that has a big influence on the overall aesthetic of your design. Okay, I think I better stop there. I think I need to stop there because we need to do a little bit of other thinking, don't we, Will?
We did have a kind of a few sort of stimulus questions, which we were going to be asking everyone to think about, which I'll just pop in the chat now. And then I think it would be a good opportunity just to open it up. And if anyone had any thoughts on responses to these questions, or indeed any experience from your own practice that today what we've talked about has resonated with and you'd like to share as practice with this network, then, or any comments, then that would be brilliant. And then we'll sort of, wind that up in 10 minutes or so, and any final questions, and then maybe talk about what's happening next time as well. So I've just popped these three in the chat. I'll just whiz you through them. So the first one that we wanted to think about was how visual materials generated or gathered by young people can be used meaningfully in play creation. Obviously, there was a lot of stuff that we talked about with School 21, but Kevin's talked about a bit as well. In terms of performance-based stuff, how can young people be empowered to generate content for spoken and physical performance around our topic in found spaces? How do you go about monologue creation, or improvising, or devising, or writing, or whatever? How can we? What's your experience of practicing that's generated material? And finally, how can young people most effectively be empowered to convert found spaces for performance within a school environment? So how can we really use young people's skills to turn these classrooms or corridors or playgrounds into spaces? And maybe we have in sort of our mind like that kind of lockdown performance thing, or maybe we just talk more generally. I wondered if anyone had any kind of comments on that, or indeed anything else that we've spoken about, or any questions.
Hello.
Hiya.
Hello. I just thought I'll just give you a little bit of feedback based on what those little points that you just said there. I think one of the things is that children. So I'm head of performing arts at St Benedict's School, and I teach drama. And I think one of the things to know really is how creative children actually are. I know at GCSE drama and A-level, we encourage children to think about set design as part of their performances, even though they don't necessarily get marks on it because they go down the route. But in terms of thinking about a whole concept, that it's that has to be part of a concept. So if they've got an idea for performance, set design kind of comes hand in hand with it. And I think the thing that's always lovely is how creative children actually are, and how well they can transform a space with very little money and very little experience, because they quite often haven't got the same limitations that we maybe as adults have got. And they will say, right, well, what I want to do, I want to paint the whole room white, I want to have loads of things hanging from the roof, I'm going to plaster everywhere with newspapers, and and they do have these very creative ideas. And sometimes it's a case of like filtering that down, But I think it's almost about empowering them and making them see that when you're doing drama, that it's not just about you doing performing, and that directing and set design and lighting design and sound, costume, and it all comes hand in hand, and it's all part of one big vision. And I think that's a really important concept for them to understand, and to be able to provide them with opportunities to do that. In terms of like changing spaces, this was quite a long time ago, but I once worked with the Mighty Creatives when they were creative partnerships back in the day. And one of the projects that we did, I think we called it changing rooms at the time, because that was when changing rooms was a bit more of a cool thing. It was over 10 years ago, but I'll never forget it, because we gave children 5 classrooms in a school, and we said, you can redesign these rooms in whatever way you want. You can come up with the designs, you can work with artists, and you can redesign them. But it's got to still be able to be workable as a classroom and whatever. And it was amazing. It was the most amazing thing that they did. And, you know, they recreated science rooms, so there's like experience corners. They had murals all over the wall. It was very sensory in the RS room, so that it could be tranquil, but it was just amazing what they did. And I think it's sometimes, I think in a school, it's about giving them opportunities to have that creativeness that's not always to do with the curriculum as well, which is tricky at times in terms of time, in terms of having that time. But I think if they get the chance, quite often I think children really surprise you, that their imagination kind of knows no bounds.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, completely hear you on that as well. And I think it's that sort of leap, isn't it, that we all as teachers kind of feel like, oh, I'm not sure I quite want to let go completely. But actually, you know, it can be the most amazing thing. And I think what an experience, that changing rooms thing, for those children to feel like they have owned and transformed their environment. What pride in their environment they created, and therefore like a sense of stake and belonging in where they are learning. Like, amazing. I applaud you for that. That's fantastic.
I think we've done something previously, actually with the First World War. So you took me back a few years, Will, and working in primary schools actually, and we took young people to the trenches in Staffordshire, and they wrote their own letters from the actual trenches. So in terms of your question about how can young people be empowered to generate content for spoken and physical performance, it's around them feeling and being in that space. And actually in terms of set and the staging, it's important for them to be immersed in that world, for them to be confident and inspired enough to create the performance and written content of a place in which they feel connected with and they have ownership over. I think a lot of the work that can happen is, okay, we need to write a poem about the First World War, or we want to write a poem about, you know, lockdown. You were talking about kind of empathy, and it's about developing the world of the play, I suppose, for those young people to really feel truly immersed in that, for them to find their own voices. And that's why I think, like that both you and Kevin were saying, actually creating this staging before and being in rehearsals right at the very beginning can actually have a more positive impact and experience for those young people. And I've seen that kind of firsthand. So that's kind of normally the way that we've worked before previously.
Yeah, there's that sense in which, like, you work with what you've got and what is created, don't you? And rather than being so goal orientated, like it needs to be this script, or it needs to be this play or this story that we're telling, it's sort of, if you put children in that place of empathy and then they create from that, how do you then marshal and craft that into something that is presented? And that's sometimes a more kind of honest and authentic approach, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess picking up very much on what I've said, what I'd be interested to see there as well is responses that are very visual driven as well, and not necessarily just words. You know, so in that World War I example, you know, particularly in an art setting, if the art department becomes the catalyst for a performance, then why not the basis of your performance start from a piece of artwork that is either an expressive response to a trench experience, or even a gathering of objects from a trench experience, and then words might come afterwards as well. So just again turning it on its head, that there's different approaches that different children will respond to as well.
I think it's the thing with empowering young people to generate content themselves is about, it's kind of what everyone said, really, what Anna said, what you said, and what Alex said about not putting the limitations on them. And I think if you start with the thing straight away of going, this isn't possible, this isn't possible, this isn't possible, this is the track we need to go down. And I don't think this is just a thing with young people, but with adults as well. As soon as you put that on people, then they go, oh, I'm not going to say that because actually that's not right, or can't afford that, or that won't work because so-and-so said it had to be this. Whereas actually they could come up with really great ideas and then they're not actually sharing them. So kind of getting out of that mindset of going, no, like, and exploring. It might be a no in the end. And I'm something that like I'm interested in kind of learning, which will probably come up in a future session that we've got booked on co-creation. Everyone just spray that in there. Is on how you have openly let that happen with young people, but at some point you've still got to say no because you've still got a project to deliver, and how you kind of work around that. How do you go, yeah, give us all these ideas, but then go, that's not possible, and then not like squash down that creativity that they've done. That isn't really that's a question, really.
Yeah, I was going to reiterate, actually, I just wondered if the team here just had any thoughts on like, how do you balance the sense of like needing to create something at the end with wanting to give children as much autonomy as possible? Do people have thoughts or reflections or experiences on that from their practice? Yeah, Anna.
I think sometimes if it's for an exam, you can quite easily say, well, the grade descriptors say this. So, you know, if it's like from a practical point of view, you can say to them, well, that's an amazing idea. And if it wasn't for an exam where we have to mark you on this, and this, then maybe we could do it. Because I think then that way, that still gives them that confidence that Lauren was talking about, that, you know, that their ideas are important and that they're valuable. But I think it's understanding that in a certain time scale that you've got to do something, and that there's certain things that you have to focus on, and you've got to prioritize certain things within a certain time period, and to kind of fit an exam board criteria. I'd say when it's work for an exam, that's something that I would always say to the children. You know, we've got to think about what's doable in the time scale. Does it all fit? But if we weren't doing that, that would be amazing. And I think that's maybe one of the things that I would say. And they're always pretty good, I think, you know, in terms of accepting that. And I think something that I'm not sure this is answering this question, but something that Lauren was talking about a minute ago. Lockdown was really interesting, I thought, because I think a lot of children kind of shared ideas more. Some of the children I wouldn't have expected to, that I teach in class, shared a lot more ideas in lockdown than what they would have done normally in a classroom situation. And some of the, like, because I did quite a lot of work on set design. We do Blood Brothers, and I did a lot of work. Did a lot of work on set design and looking at like social class and stuff, and looking at how you could show influence from like the 60s and things during that time period. And I was really amazed at the children who are really quiet normally in class, and what they came out and what they did during that time. And I think it's made me think a little bit about maybe how I kind of teach certain things and how I deliver things a little bit differently, to give those little voices kind of a little platform as well. And yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think because sometimes the responsibility is on us as well, like when there isn't an exam, or when like it might be a more of an open-ended product rather than like a production which needs to follow this script, of actually saying, okay, maybe the journey is more important. And I know I've been guilty of this in the past, of actually prioritizing how polished or clear the end product is, rather than investing time in like the autonomy of young people in that journey and saying whatever you create is fine and we will find a place for it.
I think that's why projects like this are really good, because I think sometimes in a school we're normally up against it with time, and I think to be able to have the children to be, because I know there's a couple of girls that I was talking to today who were involved in the Homegirl project, and they were so excited about it. And you know, for them, the process, like you said, is going to be something that's going to be invaluable for them. But a lot of time in school, we just don't have the time to do that. And you know, like if I'm doing school shows and stuff, I do it because I know it's a quick and easy way to do it. And I'd love for children to be more involved and coming up with ideas, but normally, because we know we've got like 3 months to do it, it's just something that has to get done, otherwise the show won't go on. A bit of an alternative to the show must go on, as we've heard a lot during lockdown. But I think that's why something like this is lovely for children to get involved with, where they're valued throughout and they're the driving force for it. Because I think that's something we struggle with in schools a little bit, is to have time for that. And I think children sometimes, the end product becomes the only thing that they focus on a little bit as well.
Fabulous. And this is just an opportunity, I suppose, for us to develop this network, a network of creative teachers and artists that are passionate about empowering young people and reimagining spaces and places as different performance spaces, and giving those young people the opportunity to be engaged through cultural opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to do. And we're also here to kind of just support you as a network of teachers that are empowered by, you know, giving young people voices and allowing them to be young artists that are emerging from our city, which is really exciting.